The Tobey Maguire movies are all in this video, the next video will just be Andrew Garfield's movies, and the video after that will only be Tom Holland's movies. I promise you they will come out faster than this video took me. Yeah, I might have lied, just a little bit. To be honest, I feel like I open up every video with, sorry guys, I know I haven't posted in a minute, even though I said I would. So yeah, at this point, you should probably be used to it. It's kind of like a staple of the channel, I guess you could say. But yeah, a little over a year ago, I posted the first part in this series where I reviewed the first 3 Spider-Man movies, the live-action ones starring Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst. And so naturally, this is the second part to that series where I'm going to be reviewing the Andrew Garfield Amazing Spider-Man movies from the early to mid 2010s. I'm not going to waste any more time, but by the way, I'm going to be showing as little of the movies as possible because my last video was a fucking nightmare trying to upload it. Sony just kept copyright striking me every time I would post it, and it just wouldn't be able to be viewed by anybody. Eventually got around that issue by doing some clever editing tricks, which I might have to do in this video. So if you see this silly ass watermark, then it's just something you're gonna have to deal with, or else the video wouldn't be posted at all. Okay, The Amazing Spider-Man, released in 2012 and directed by Mark Webb. The movie opens up with a flashback scene to young Peter Parker looking for his parents in their home when he discovers their house has been broken into by someone. Honestly, this scene is pretty unimportant until the next movie. It basically is just trying to show that his parents are in danger, so they have to drop them off with Uncle Ben and Aunt May. Flash forward to the present day Peter Parker, played by Andrew Garfield. Now, I really shit on Tobey Maguire in the last video because he's really dull and boring and emotionless in most of the trilogy. Luckily, Andrew Garfield just doesn't suffer from those issues, and he actually brings a pretty layered and nuanced performance to the table for this character that we haven't seen and probably will never see again. The only complaint that I have about him is this very exaggerated New Yorker accent that he puts on. Oh, boys in blue here! Yo, I got him! It's way worse in the second movie, but it definitely does have its moments here. I'm just really surprised that nobody stopped him from doing this. Like, they let that fly.
Just one guy, just one Spider-Man, or woman, we don't know, for sure.
And you know what? Before anything else, I gotta address something about the general consensus on the internet about these movies. Look, I love Cosmonaut Variety Hour as much as the next guy, but this is just a shit-ass take.
He has way too much confidence. He doesn't have that wallflower quality that Peter Parker needs. He's not a nerdy outcast, he's a fucking skater punk.
I've been seeing a lot of people make this argument over the years for why they don't like these movies, and it's that Andrew Garfield is too cool looking or too attractive to be Peter Parker accurately. My question has always been, where's the fucking Spider-Man rulebook that says he has to be an unattractive loser? Specifically Peter. I know, whatever. There's different versions. There's hundreds of fucking Spider-Men in the Spider-Verse and whatever, dude. Go watch those movies if you want. I don't know. Yes, it is true that before being bitten by the spider, most iterations of Peter are kind of nerdy and down on their luck with the ladies, and you know, they're shy. But so is this version. Within the first 15 minutes of this movie, they give you this little fake out thing where you think he's being asked out by this girl, but she actually just wants him to take pictures of her boyfriend's car. And then he creepily takes pictures of Gwen Stacy from a distance, and then gets bitched by Flash Thompson in the next scene. There was also this, for some reason, deleted scene of him missing this trick on a skateboard and absolutely busting his ass and knocking like 5 people's lunches on the ground. Honestly, it's probably deleted because this would have put him in aura debt for the rest of the movie. Oh, yo, cut this shit out of the edit. And oh yeah, this guy skateboards in the hallways of his high school. And the amount of people I've seen say that being a skater automatically makes him too cool is fucking ridiculous. This is blasphemy, even some may say. Skating does not make you cool. In fact, I would say a majority of skaters are insufferable gatekeeping dorks. And I get that this was the early 2010s when skateboarding was hailed as the ultimate status of coolness amongst the younger generation, like myself, admittedly. But he's still a fucking nerd, bro. This guy is wearing a hoodie with thumb holes in the sleeves. Stop trying to gaslight me, you Redditors. Anyways, like I said, Peter gets rocked by Flash Thompson for standing up for the guy he's holding upside down by the ankles. Alright. Where did these writers go to high school, bro? This is some shit straight out of the Disney Channel original movie cutting room floor. This is some shit that little ginger boy from Max Keeble would have done. Maybe Max Keeble is a little too niche and old to be referenced. Maybe I'm a little bit too old to be making videos about Spider-Man, but shut the fuck up. It's movies like this that make kids that haven't made it to high school yet think that they're going to be shoved in lockers and given swirlies in the toilets and shit. Flash Thompson is unrealistically antagonistic in most of the media that he's introduced in, but in this slightly more realistic and grounded universe that they're trying to set up for themselves, it stands out as extra out of the ordinary here. Like, do you really not have anything better to be doing? I mean, if we're being honest, it looks like yo old ass already got held back a couple of times. I guess you could consider this Spider-Man's very first villain the Super Senior. His power is preying on freshman girls. Add that shit to the Amazing Spider-Man wiki. So after that whole altercation, we cut to a classroom where we get the introduction of Gwen Stacy in a short conversation where she commends Peter for standing up for that kid and suggests that he should see the school nurse. Now let me just say that watching this after watching the Raimi trilogy, it's pretty obvious that the writing surrounding Peter's main love interest is drastically different here. In the original trilogy, it's almost like the writers forgot, or they were actually trying to make you dislike Mary Jane more. Like, they forgot to make her likable, I think. There are very few scenes between Kirsten Dunst and Tobey Maguire that even kind of suggest that they have some kind of chemistry together, and outside of that handful of scenes, they're either arguing or Peter is just staring at her while she tries to communicate. The Amazing Spider-Man fixes this issue by having two incredibly talented people in the main roles that actually conversate like either one of them has actually spoken to another person before. Emma Stone and Andrew Garfield have a natural chemistry in this movie together. It actually feels like they're in a believable relationship. And this is kind of important when a lot of the emotional tension in the story is focused on Peter and his love interest. It's like one of the key aspects of the character almost. Alright, the next scene, the audience is introduced to Aunt May and Uncle Ben, played by Sally Fields and Martin Sheen. And I really do like these two characters. Unfortunately, due to the writing, they kind of end up making Uncle Ben unreasonably stupid, but I'll get to that later. There's a flood in the basement, which Ben and Peter go down to investigate when Peter finds his dad's old briefcase. Because his dad left a briefcase. That's all I got, a briefcase full of junk. Whatever, I don't know, I try not to think about it. When he takes the briefcase upstairs, Ben and May are visibly shaken by it. Inside, he finds a picture of his father standing next to another scientist. A pair of prescription glasses that apparently work just fine for Peter because that's totally how eyesight works. Along with that, he finds a manila folder with the Oscorp logo that has some fancy algorithm that'll be important in the story later. Ben comes in to have a chat with Peter about his father and gives him the name of the scientist in the photo, that being Dr. Kurt Connors. And any Spider-Man fan can probably already see where this is going. Peter does some research and finds out that his dad and Kurt were working on cross-species genetics and that his parents were killed in a plane crash, something he apparently never thought to look up until now. Okay, movie. He finds out Kurt Connors is still working at Oscorp and decides to iCarly transition to Oscorp Tower. Conveniently, the internship tour that Peter sneaks into is being guided by Gwen Stacy. There's a brief moment where Kurt is speaking to the group and Peter is the only person who responds with the correct answer. Now, this may seem like a small thing, but I really enjoy when a piece of Spider-Man media strikes a good balance for Peter's intelligence between very obnoxiously overstated or basically non-existent. In these movies, Peter says smart things sometimes, but it's not like every other sentence he says, you know? Anyways, Peter bumps into some guy who drops a folder on the ground that has the same 00 markings on it that the folder in his dad's briefcase had earlier. So he follows this guy over to where web fluid is being developed. Wait, Oscorp made the web fluid in this universe? So does Peter reverse engineer this formula to make his own, or does he have to sneak into Oscorp every time he needs to refill his web shooters? If that's the case, then they need way better security. Anyways, Peter finds himself in a room full of genetically enhanced spiders where he accidentally sets some kind of sensor off that drops a bunch of them on top of his head. Gee, I sure wonder where this is gonna go. We're shown a brief conversation between Kurt Connors and the guy Peter bumped into earlier, where we learn that Dr. Connors is trying to develop a cure for a dying Norman Osborn using the decay rate algorithm, which was also written on a piece of paper inside of Peter's dad's bag. And apparently, not much progress has been made because he can't figure out this little math equation. Now, something that I noticed while rewatching this movie this time is that this plotline with Kurt Connors and the cure is the same exact plotline as Norman Osborn in the super serum from the original 2002 Spider-Man movie. Don't believe me? I'll prove it to you. Renowned scientist is attempting to make a special serum that is in very experimental stages of development, the importance of which is great enough to cost them their job or the company as a whole. When pressure is applied from a higher up, even though it's stated to be deemed unsafe, they are forced to use said experimental serum on themselves, which accidentally transforms them into supervillains. What's funny is that a genuine criticism that I have for these movies is that at times it can feel like they were really going out of their way to differentiate themselves from the Sam Raimi films. Like, they specifically go out of their way to overcomplicate things that could have been way simpler and made more sense if it followed closer to those movies, but we've already done that before, so we can't do it. Which is just kind of a silly mindset to me. I do want to say that I think having the Lizard be this Spider-Man's first big bad is very fitting for this universe, because it's established that Richard Parker and Kurt Connors were both studying cross-species genetics for years and discovering different ways that they could give humans animalistic attributes. And it's pretty poetic how Peter is the example of the kind of best-case scenario of his father's lifetime work, using the incredible abilities that he gained to help others. And Kurt is an example of the worst case scenario, becoming what ultimately scared Richard into abandoning the project. At their core, they directly parallel each other, and that is always a great basis for a protagonist and antagonist in any story. Peter gets scolded by Gwen and told to leave when he's bitten on the back of the neck by one of the spiders that fell on him earlier. It then cuts to Peter sleeping on the train ride home, where this idiot tries to balance a beer bottle on his head, which causes his developing spider sense to go all crazy. He wakes up, jumps on the ceiling, rips this lady's shirt off, and kicks everybody's ass for almost no reason. Also, I don't know if this was like an editing mistake or something, but this guy switches from a black guy to a white guy in these two cuts, and I really don't like continuity errors, so that's always bothered me. And this is really the only time in the movie where the editing is genuinely a problem for me. For some reason, somebody decided to flash a black screen every time Peter lands an attack. And I don't know if this was like an artistic decision, but it really just looks like somebody forgot to connect these two clips in the edit. Peter gets home and he's absolutely geeking off that web cartridge. But no, for real though, it really just feels like they instructed Andrew Garfield to act like he was high out of his fucking mind. Like, just look at this. This guy's not doing okay at all. Next up, we're treated with my absolutely favorite protagonist slowly realizing they've gained superpowers scene of all time. A little bit later, Peter just shows up at Kurt's house where he's almost turned away because obviously that's a little strange and stalkerish, till he reveals that he's Richard Parker's son, which makes him immediately interested. They talk a little bit until the subject focuses on the decay rate algorithm, which Peter apparently solves after what is implied to be like a few days max of research, which makes Kurt out to be kind of dumb by comparison, but who really cares? Now here's another thing ripped straight from the Raimi movies, where a newly powered Peter embarrasses Flash right in front of a bunch of other students. But instead of fucking caving his chest in, he just does this little gag with the basketball before shoulder checking him to the ground and dunking on him so hard that he shatters the backboard. That is the most insane travel I've ever seen, by the way. Where the fuck is the ref when you need him? So naturally, Peter gets in trouble and Uncle Ben gets called to the school, where he's scolded for all of his theatrics. And he lets him know that he has to switch shifts to be there, so now Peter has to pick up Aunt May. Now maybe I'm just uninformed because I don't live in a walkable city like New York, but Peter doesn't have a car and can't drive as far as we know. So how exactly was he expected to pick up Aunt May? On his fucking skateboard? Or by pick up, does he mean just walking with her from the train station to the house? I don't fucking know, man. The writing in these movies is just an eensy bit of dookie. There's this little scene after Ben is done talking with him where Peter and Gwen agree to go on a date, I think. I understand they were going for the shy, risless teenagers not knowing how to talk to each other trope, but I seriously think that at this point in the script it just says Andrew and Emma act cute together and they just filled in the dialogue themselves.
So you want to, I don't know.
Want to what?
I don't know. Just, I don't know, we could, or we could do something else, or we could, if you don't, I mean, like, we could...
Yeah.
Anyways, Peter does exactly what Uncle Ben specifically told him not to do, and completely forgets about Aunt May to test out his powers by skating and doing parkour in this big warehouse. Something that I really like about this scene is that this little part here where he swings on the chain is directly paralleled later in the movie when he's running from the police and he has his first real web swing sequence on the bridge. Like, it's actually shot for shot, and I really like that. After that, we get a scene of Peter and Dr. Connors at Oscorp testing out different variables with the decay rate algorithm until the regeneration serum they've been trying to develop finally shows some promising results. They inject it into a 3-legged rat named Fred and wait to see what happens. Peter finally arrives home to a furious Uncle Ben, who is mad because, like I said, he just completely forgot to pick up his aunt with his imaginary car. So naturally, there is an argument over this, and it's clear that Uncle Ben is the only person that's really upset about it. Now, do you remember earlier when I said that this movie tends to overcomplicate itself in order to differentiate from the Raimi films? Well, this is no more apparent than in the Great Responsibility speech. In Spider-Man 2002, Uncle Ben just straight up says, "With great power comes great responsibility." It's short, it's sweet, it's to the point, it's even shorter than the one from the comics, which for those of you that don't know, the original quote that's often recited incorrectly is, "With great power, there must also come great responsibility." But in this movie, we don't get any of that. Uncle Ben goes on this whole fucking yap fest, and I don't want to show the scene because it's kind of long and I don't want to be put on Sony's hit list again, so I'm just going to read it out for you. "You're a lot like your father, and that's a good thing, but your father lived by a philosophy, a principle really. He believed that if you could do good things for other people, you had a moral obligation to do those things. That's what's at stake here. Not choice, responsibility." Yeah, a 6-word phrase lengthened to a paragraph, all because Sony is trying to one-up themselves. But despite all of that, I do really like this scene, especially Peter's response to Uncle Ben.
That's nice. That's great. It's all well and good, so where is he?
What?
Where is he? Where's my dad? He didn't think it was his responsibility to be here to tell me this himself.
Oh, come on, how dare you?
How dare I? How dare you?
It's a very well performed scene that's got more genuine emotion than any of the emotional scenes in the original trilogy. So Peter leaves the house, accidentally shattering the glass door with his untamed super strength, and Uncle Ben follows in pursuit. Now get ready, because we're about to watch one of the worst edited and poorly thought out sequences in any of these movies, any superhero movie, honestly, if you ask me. Uncle Ben is walking down the sidewalks of New York, yelling Peter's name like he's a lost dog. Peter attempts to evade him and goes to get a bottle of milk from a convenience store, and when Peter is 2 cents short, he tries to take 2 pennies from the take a penny, leave a penny jar. The dickhead cashier stops him and says, "What, Daddy didn't give you enough milk money today?" And he tells him to step aside. Peter finally gives up, but the guy behind him in line walks up and knocks like a rack or something off of the cash register counter so he can steal money from the register while the cashier is picking the stuff up. And at the same time, he tosses Peter his milk while he's on the way out. The dickhead cashier realizes what just happened and he starts trying to chase down the thief. Like an actual buffoon, he turns to Peter and asks him to help chase the guy down. Now hear me out. Even if he was given over-the-top customer service, to ask of any customer to chase down a thief is absolutely insane and a massive legal concern, especially considering the fact that you have no idea he's fucking Spider-Man. But what's even worse is that this is trying to emulate the I missed the part where that's my problem scene from Spider-Man 2002. But in that scene, Peter is way more justified because he was just gypped out of like $2,500. But in this movie, with the way these events unfold, Uncle Ben loses his life over a measly 2 cents.
2 cents. We're talking about 2 cents.
Just step
people.
aside, kid.
It's almost like this scene is ripped out of 2008's superhero movie with how fucking silly this is. And don't even get me started on how laughably stupid they make Uncle Ben's death. The thief is running down the street as the cashier is yelling, "Somebody stop that guy," while running behind him, when he suddenly trips and falls right in front of Uncle Ben, dropping a gun on the ground. And instead of just minding his business and continuing to look for Peter, he stupidly yells, "Hey!" and decides to scramble for the gun. And obviously that ends in him getting shot and killed, but like, I can't feel that bad when it's obviously his fault. Back at the Parker household, Aunt May and Peter are being given some information on the suspect that shot Uncle Ben, and Peter immediately realizes it's the guy that he chose not to stop from robbing the store. Also, the movie is going to treat you like you're dumb and show you this little flashback to Peter noticing the star tattoo on the guy's wrist like 3 more times, in case you just didn't get it the first time. For example, a little later we see Peter's first few attempts to find Uncle Ben's killer, which ends in him being chased by a large group of dudes. When he finally takes down the original dude he was beating on, he looks at his wrist for the tattoo, and not only do they flash it on the screen, but they play the same audio clip of the cop saying,
He has a star tattooed on his left hand.
like, bro, please, this shit happened 10 minutes ago. I didn't forget. I could re-edit this scene to make it so much better. Man, they should have just hired me. No, I'm kidding. In 2012, I was literally 8 years old, and that's probably why I love this movie so much. Anyways, the guy gets away, and Peter falls through a roof where he sees a big poster of a wrestling mask, which gives him the idea to conceal his identity the next time he goes crime fighting. Which is something you would assume he would have thought of already, because he's so intelligent. But what do I know? What do I know? This is where we see him take some time to design and create his web shooters and climb a tall building to test them out. Unfortunately, they misfire and he plummets to the ground and fucking dies. No, of course I'm just kidding. They work just fine. So we get a short montage of Peter tracking down guys who fit the description of Uncle Ben's killer, and we see his first time being recognized by the police, namely Captain Stacy, Gwen's father. And this is where he ends up making the iconic red and blue suit everybody expects Spider-Man to be wearing. Now, in my last video, I talked about how I'm not a big fan of Tobey's suit. I think the pointy eyes make him a little bit too menacing looking, which works for the symbiotic suit, but not for the regular one. The logo being black, but the webbing being silver really bothers me. And the muscle suit that they put under it is so large that it's almost uncanny. Maybe I'm a little biased, but I prefer my Spider-Man and specifically Peter Parker designs to be a little bit on the lankier side, because it's fitting for the character to be fast and nimble, and I think that translates better with a smaller character as opposed to the absolutely yoked Batman and Superman-esque physique. That kind of stuff could fly on a comic book page, but when it's translated to the big screen, it creates a little bit of a disconnect for me. So a lot of people used to hate on this suit back in the day. They used to say it was over textured, that his head looked like a basketball. But even if I'm not a fan of the missing red belt section, I still think that this suit is really solid. And you know, some people might think that me critiquing the character design can be a bit nitpicky, but I think one of the most important things that you have to keep in mind when you're translating these comic book heroes to live action is that the key aspect is that they're supposed to be cool to look at, and they're supposed to be visually interesting. And when you don't achieve that, it makes the illusion of a character that's supposed to be badass fade very quickly. Like, look at Michael Keaton's Batman. Look at this cool and menacing silhouette, and watch it all fade away as soon as he goes to take a corner and you realize he can't move his fucking neck. It looks ridiculous. Batman looks like a goddamn goober in these movies, and that's all because of that damn suit. Anyways, this is a Spider-Man video. So yeah, Andrew's suit in this movie is pretty nice. I like that the lenses have a yellow tint and they're made from repurposed sunglasses, and the shoes look like a generic athletic brand sneaker. It makes a lot of sense for this stuff to be incorporated into a suit made by a high schooler on a limited budget. Again, the only thing I'm not a huge fan of is the removal of the red belt section, because in my opinion it causes a lack of red in the suit. There's a whole lot of blue going around, but not enough red, and that just doesn't sit right with me. So after Peter has made his web shooters and suit, he continues the hunt for Uncle Ben's killer, and I think it's important to note that while he has the suit and the gadgets, Peter isn't really Spider-Man yet. As in, he doesn't have the right mentality, because he's still hunting down the man with the star tattoo with what seems like the intent to kill, or at least the intent to do extreme harm to, but it's gonna take a couple more scenes before he takes what Uncle Ben told him to heart and realizes that he can do more with these abilities than just acts of revenge, which is all he's really used them for so far. The scene in particular where I think it really solidifies in Peter's brain is where he's sitting on his bedroom floor just staring at his mask on the ground, and there's no dialogue in this scene because you can just tell that he's thinking like, holy shit, I can be so much more. I can be a symbol of hope for a lot of people. And I think this sort of gradual process of him becoming Spider-Man is a lot more interesting than just oh man, I'm so mad, I'm gonna go kill this guy right now. Oh, he tripped and he fell out of a window, so I guess I should go be a hero now. And spoiler alert, he never even catches Uncle Ben's killer in this movie. He decides to give up that crusade, like, full stop after a scene we're just about to discuss. So we get the first scene of Peter crime fighting with him stopping this car thief, and I gotta say, Andrew's take on the quippy, comedic Spider-Man dialogue is so good.
You know, in the future, if you're gonna steal cars, don't dress like a car thief, man.
What are you? You a cop?
Really? You seriously think I'm a cop? Cop in a skin-tight red and blue suit. You know, you've got a mind of the true scholar, sir.
His on-screen presence is just top-notch and so fitting for the character. Basically, there's no more, did your husband buy you that outfit? I actually recited that joke incorrectly. The original is, that's a cute outfit. Did your husband give it to you? I can't believe that I, #1 Spider-Man fan, don't know every single piece of dialogue from the most beloved trilogy, but nobody is perfect. Back to you, me. Or
It's you who's out, Gobby. Out of your mind.
Not to go on another tangent, but Spider-Man's comedy is also a super important aspect of his character to nail. Some pieces of media make him unironically comedic. You know, the kind of dialogue that might make you exhale out of your nose all the way to maybe a light giggle. Other pieces of media make him funny in a dad joke way, where the idea of him thinking that his jokes are funny when they're not is the actual joke to the audience. The absolute worst version of this dialogue is the did I actually just say that out loud-esque dialogue? You know what I'm talking about. This is especially a problem in the PlayStation games. Any piece of dialogue where Peter or Miles makes a joke and then they shortly pause to do that whole, don't you get it, everybody? Maybe they'll get it next time. Like, nobody's laughing at that.
Sucks to be you. I got feathers. Not sound as cool as I thought it would.
That kind of shit makes me scoff in annoyance every time it happens. And in my opinion, people who write comedy like that are just too insecure to actually try and be funny, so they cover it in this layer of self-awareness to compensate. But thankfully, Peter is actually just funny in these movies. So he webs up the thief, and as he realizes it's not the guy with the star tattoo, the police show up and immediately hold Peter at gunpoint, which he swiftly handles. I think this whole sequence is great, and unfortunately, it's one of the very few scenes in this movie of him just doing general Spider-Manning that's not lizard related. There's a little montage in Amazing Spider-Man 2 that I'm gonna talk about later, which was essentially Peter going on Spider-Man side quests, just general crime fighting, and I think that this movie could have used just a little bit more of that to solidify him as an established hero. But enough of my silly complaints, because Peter is doing his very first web swing under the George Washington Bridge. At least that's what Google said. I don't fucking know. After that, we get this very well acted and dramatic scene that really drives home how Uncle Ben's death, as well as Peter's new double life, is affecting both him and Aunt May.
Where do you go? Who does this to you?
Please go to sleep, Aunt May.
Please tell me.
Aunt May, please, please, please go to sleep.
I can't sleep. Don't you understand? I can't sleep. Peter, listen to me. Secrets have a cost. They're not for free. Not now, not ever.
I'm gonna speed through the next couple of scenes because it's a lot of back and forth between the Lizard's origin story and Peter and Gwen shenanigans. Kurt Connors is being pressured by this Oscorp higher-up to begin human trials with the regrowth serum that's been extracted from lizard DNA, and he refuses, so he gets his job taken away. And do I even really need to explain this again? Gwen invites Peter to dinner at her apartment. I guess you could call this foreshadowing happens. I don't know, I think it's a cool shot. Speaking of shots, Kurt starts tweaking off of that lizard serum, and then we cut to Peter showing up to Gwen's apartment, and holy shit, this second act moves quickly. Something of note is that Gwen isn't weirded out that Peter climbed 20 stories up a fire escape to enter her bedroom through the window, and Captain Stacy also doesn't question the fact that he's in her room despite not ever coming through the front door. Next, Kurt wakes up with his new arm that he has to rip out of this little cocoon thingy, and I really like the way that the arm looks super smooth and a little chubby, almost emulating like a baby's skin. He tries to get a hold of the doctor to share his breakthrough, but he can only get a hold of his assistant that tells Kurt he's currently being driven over a bridge. So Kurt gets in a taxi in pursuit, But as to be expected, things start to go quickly wrong as he begins transforming into the lizard in the back seat.
Are you tweaking, man?
Just drive.
Okay. Speaking of going quickly wrong, man, I'm just on top of these transitions today. Peter and Captain Stacy argue at the dinner table because Spider-Man becomes the topic of conversation. And of course, Peter gets heated and defensive because in his mind, he's trying to help the public. But to George, he is a clumsy, masked vigilante, which, I mean, two things can be true at once, you know? I think that this is actually the beginning of Peter's rude awakening about the public's perception of Spider-Man. Anyways, yada yada, Peter excuses himself from the dinner table and he apologizes to George Stacy. And on the rooftop of her apartment building, Peter tells Gwen that he is Spider-Man. They kiss each other, but they're interrupted by Gwen's mother. And as she leaves to go back downstairs, he senses danger from far away and jumps off the roof to see what's going on. Also, this is the first time that I really noticed it because I've never watched this movie with headphones before, but when the spider sense sound effect happens in the scene, I could actually feel a shiver down my spine. It was fucking crazy. Honestly, all of the sound design and music in both of these movies is some of my favorite in the entire franchise. His main theme is so heroic and uplifting, and I don't even know how to explain it. Now this is an important scene. Kurt has finally transformed into the lizard and he's throwing cars off of the Williamsburg Bridge. But luckily, Spider-Man makes it in enough time to stop most of the casualties, including this little boy named Jack. And this is that scene that I was alluding to earlier that I said would teach Peter what it really means to be Spider-Man. Peter jumps down to the car being suspended above the water with a singular web, and he pulls off the back windshield. At first, the little boy doesn't understand and is afraid until Peter eases the situation by finding out his name is Jack from his book bag.
What's your name? Jack?
Yes.
Let's get you out of here.
Along with taking off his mask and giving it to him to let him know that he's just a normal guy. Peter undoes Jack's seatbelt as gasoline leaks down to the cracked headlight and begins to set the car on fire. The web line the car was hanging from initially burns, and Peter has to quickly shoot another one, with the car now only being supported by his strength. He asks him to climb up, but paralyzed by fear, Jack tells Peter that he can't. So, as the situation dires, he tells Jack to put on the mask and that it'll make him strong.
Put it on! The mask! It's gonna make you strong!
Something only a child would really believe, but just these simple acts of reassurance are enough to give Jack the confidence to begin climbing. It's a close call, and Peter almost isn't able to save him, but he manages to web him up just in time as the car falls to the water below, and when returning the boy to his distraught father, this scene plays out.
My son. Who are you? Spider-Man.
Oh man, I love this movie. It cuts to the scene I referenced earlier with Peter quietly sitting on his floor staring at the mask that instilled someone with so much faith that it ultimately saved their life. And like I said, there's no inner monologue in this scene. We don't need Peter to go, and then I knew what I had to do, what I had to become. It's all just implied. And it's such an incredible sequence, if you ask me. This Peter is now officially Spider-Man, which is what Captain Stacy refers to him as when publicly issuing a warrant for his arrest. Yeah, even when Spider-Man does objectively good things, he's still seen as a criminal to the public. This is something the 2002 movie tried to tackle, but it was mostly played for laughs there. You know, the whole shtick with Jonah Jameson always somehow spinning the narrative to make Spider-Man out to be a menace to society. But it's an actual serious conflict in this movie, and it's not played for laughs, and I think I like that a little bit better. We then cut to Peter showing up to Oscorp looking to get tips from Kurt on how to track down a lizard. And he's obviously acting out of the ordinary and vaguely threatens Peter.
So, because of the cold blood, would they react to sudden changes in temperatures?
Well, you'd have to catch one first. Did you know there's a rumor of a new species in New York? Beautiful and quite large.
What do you know about it? You seen it?
No, it's not yet classified. it can be aggressive if threatened.
We see Fred the Rat again, who the serum was tested on earlier, and he's gotten big as hell and is eating another rat. So given that and the weird scales on the side of his face, Peter concludes that Dr. Connors used the growth serum and transformed into the giant monster that was on the bridge. He tries to go to Captain Stacy with these concerns, but is ultimately dismissed because he obviously just doesn't like Peter all that much, and because he directly names Curt Connors. George defends him by saying that he gave Gwen a very good letter of recommendation to get into college, and he makes a couple references to Godzilla.
But you would have me believe that he, in his spare time, is running around dressed up like a giant dinosaur.
Not dressing up and not a dinosaur. He has transformed himself into a giant lizard.
Let me ask you a question. Do I look like the mayor of Tokyo to you?
After that, he has Peter escorted out of the precinct. Basically, Captain Stacy is the worst cop of all time until it's far too late. So Peter takes shit into his own hands, dropping down into the sewers in search of the lizard. There was a few scenes before this that I didn't bring up that showed Dr. Connors setting up this little base of operations down in the sewers, and I was trying to decide on when to bring this up, but there is a shit ton of deleted and altered scenes from this movie that, in my opinion, would have made it one of, if not the best, on-screen Spider-Man origin story. You remember that whole spiel I went on earlier about Uncle Ben's stupid death scene? Well, there was an alternate version that made a whole lot more sense, where he follows a shadowed figure that kinda looks like Peter into an alleyway, but it ends up being presumably the Star Tattoo dude. In this version, we never actually see Uncle Ben get shot on screen, which is a lot better in my opinion. Along with some other more minor things, there was also a lot of deleted scenes that gave Curt Connors a lot more character building and personal stakes in the story, like him interacting with his wife and son, who are completely absent from the theatrical cut. And there's also some additional interactions between him and Peter, like Curt giving him condolences for Uncle Ben's murder and encouraging him to continue their work with the regrowth serum at the apparent success with Fred the Rat. The reason I'm bringing this up at all is because if you didn't notice, in the theatrical cut, Peter really has no reason to search down in the sewers for Dr. Connors. But there's a deleted scene of him doing some reconnaissance on the rooftops, and he essentially follows Curt to find out where he's hiding. There's so many scenes like this with additional context that could have made this movie so much better and made a lot more sense, but seemingly due to studio interference to keep the movie under a certain runtime, a large amount of them were cut. And there's something about that that's really interesting to me. There's an entire pre-visualized fight scene between Peter and the lizard that was going to take place during the day, unlike almost any fight scene in the final cut that all take place at night. This looks like it could have been a really exciting set piece, with Peter getting tackled through buildings while trying to restrain him and evade attacks. The bridge rescue had an additional scene of the little boy putting Peter's mask on for him, repeating what he told him about making him strong to help climb out of the car. I think what we got in the theatrical cut works just fine, but this is just that little extra cherry on top, you know? There are numerous scenes that try and humanize Dr. Connors, really showcasing his fear of what he's become and how the serum twists his mind into thinking that he's better off as the lizard. Along with those scenes, there's an entire cut sequence that looks like it was almost complete, and some of the clips from it actually make it into the final cut. In this scene, Peter follows Dr. Connors into the sewer after the fight in the school, where he discovers his laboratory, and he offers to try and help cure him, but Curt throws it right back in Peter's face.
I'm gonna get you back.
Would you go back? After all you know you can do, all the power you feel.
This scene ends with Dr. Rotha, the higher-up from Oscorp, coming in at just the right time to shoot Curt as he's about to transform back into the lizard, effectively saving Peter from yet another fight. He also sprays a sedative in Peter's face and reveals some information connecting Richard Parker to the research behind the growth serum and the spider that bit Peter. This whole plotline surrounding Peter's father's connection to the super spider is almost completely gone from the final cut. If you're wondering where I'm getting all of this footage from, there's a video made by CMV Entertainment that compiles almost every deleted, cut, altered scene from this movie, and I'll have it linked link down in the description if you're interested. It kind of makes me sad to think about what this movie could have been, and when you look at what ideas and concepts that were ultimately left on the cutting room floor, it's hard not to dislike the final product just a little bit more. But I'm not here to review what could have been. I'm here to review what actually released in theaters. So enough about all of that. This next scene is fucking awesome, where Peter spins an actual web down in the sewers to find the lizard, which leads to this encounter that leaves Peter severely injured, but he manages to get away, at the cost of the lizard figuring out that Spider-Man is in fact Peter Parker, because he finds the camera with Peter's name on it that he was trying to use to get pictures of the lizard. So next is the fight scene at the school, which in my opinion is tied with the train sequence from Spider-Man 2 as the best fight sequence for Spider-Man on screen. This is the first time I felt the need to bring it up, but the CGI and the special effects in these two movies is fucking incredible. I feel like the movies in the early 2010s had some of the best CGI of all time, especially compared to movies a few years before it, and even a lot of movies now. The quality of CGI is always heavily dependent on how much time the crew is given, and it's very clear that a lot of time and effort was put in here, and I'm very appreciative of that. I love how fast Peter moves in this fight, especially with the way he crawls around and webs up the lizard trying to restrain him like, I don't know, an actual spider would. And after shit settles, the lizard retreats back down into the sewers, leading Peter right to his lab, where he learns that Dr. Connor's plan is to build some kind of device on top of the Oscorp building to spread the lizard gas across the city with the idea of healing everyone. And creating a world without weakness. But obviously, it would just turn the entire city into lizards. He tells Gwen to go to Oscorp to begin synthesizing a cure. Now, you're kind of given the impression that Kurt is still kind of in control when he's in his lizard form, and at least he still has all of Kurt's memories. So when they try to do this whole he thinks he's doing a good deed but he's actually committing acts of terrorism trope, it doesn't exactly work for me. Kurt has to know that turning everybody into lizards is an objectively bad thing to do, and he just doesn't care. So at best, he doesn't know what he's doing, and at worst, he is cartoonishly evil. So we catch up with the lizard on his way to Oscorp when a team of SWAT agents engage him and gun him down, which obviously doesn't work, and gets all of them turned into lizards with his little gas grenades. With Peter also on his way to Oscorp, he has a run-in with the police, and we get the second first-person web-swinging scene, which I think is really cool in concept, and something I wish we got a little bit more of. While swinging though, he gets shot with this little taser bullet thingy, sending him to the ground unconscious. Peter is put in handcuffs and unmasked by Captain Stacy. In efforts to conceal his identity, he disarms and apprehends all of the officers without showing his face, but he's held at gunpoint and forced to reveal his identity to the captain. Peter informs him that the lizard is heading towards Oscorp, which is also where Gwen is, and given that information, Captain Stacy decides to let him go. And despite being given the order to stand down, one of the officers shoots Peter in the leg as he escapes. Yeah, no wonder why this version of Peter stands pretty proudly with a cab. We cut back to Gwen at Oscorp tripping the fire alarm to try and keep Dr. Connors away from the dispersal machine. It doesn't do much because the lizard can easily rip through this door, and we get this Jurassic Park-esque horror scene of Gwen hiding from him. She gets away safely, but Connors gets a hold of the device. Meanwhile, Peter is still trying to get to Oscorp, obviously struggling with an injured leg, when the father of the young boy Peter saved on the bridge notices him on TV, and he starts pulling all the strings that he can as a construction worker to line up a bunch of cranes across the city to give Spider-Man a clear shot to web swing on. Despite this being an obvious parallel to the "you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us" scene from Spider-Man 2002, I really like this scene, especially with how visually impressive it is. So we're nearing the final confrontation on the roof of Oscorp Tower as Peter spots the lizard climbing to the top with a dispersal device strapped to his back. We see that Gwen made it out of the building safely as she gives the cure to her father, telling him that she needs to get it to Spider-Man, which he decides to do himself. Remember how I said George is a really bad cop until it's too late? Yeah. Peter engages the lizard, and there's a short fight before he gets grabbed by both arms, with both of his web shooters getting crushed. And that's when Captain Stacy pops out with the shotgun to give Peter a hand. They use a combination of liquid nitrogen to slow his healing process, and the shotgun blast to temporarily subdue him as Peter rushes to the device to replace the lizard gas with the cure. Unfortunately, his luck runs out, and Captain Stacy is fatally stabbed by the lizard's claws. Thanks to his sacrifice, though, Peter is able to get the cure into the device before it's too late, transforming the lizard back into Kurt Connors, along with anyone else in the city that got gassed. A human Kurt saves Peter from falling off of the building and finally coming to his senses, realizing all of the terror that he's caused. Peter gets in his final words with George where he admits to being wrong about Peter, but he makes him promise to essentially stay away from Gwen to keep her safe from the enemies he will inevitably make as Spider-Man. Something Peter obviously has trouble complying with. There's the obligatory sad Spider-Man funeral scene. Gwen shows up to Peter's house to confront him on why he didn't bother showing up, where he tells her that he can't see her anymore, which is when she makes the realization that this was her father's doing.
You made you promise, didn't he? To stay away from me, so I'd be safe.
Aunt May is the one to convince him to stop being a little bitch, and I actually really like this movie here at the end, so I'm gonna let it play out.
Mr. Parker, tardy again. Well, at least we can always count on you.
Sorry, Miss Ritter, won't happen again, I promise.
Don't make promises you can't keep, Mr. Parker.
Yeah, but those are the best kind.
Okay, class, open your books. Let's begin on page 1.
The last scene of the movie is this short swinging sequence that's gotta be one of my favorites of the franchise. The poses, the lighting, the actual swinging choreography, if you want to call it that, it's just so satisfying to my eyeballs, and the movie ends on this shot. Man, despite having very similar foundations to the original trilogy, I think the slightly more grounded and realistic tone is very refreshing, and it highlights a whole new layer of anger and angst to the character that takes some time to be channeled into doing good things for other people. I have to admit, I have my issues with aspects of the editing at times. It can cause some things to not make too much sense. I think the whole second and the beginning of the third act feels like it moves a little too fast. Like, that was definitely the part that they butchered to save on runtime. But overall, I can have my nitpicks, but this is a really solid viewing experience and a really good execution of a Spider-Man origin story on screen. I don't know why I waited until the end of the video to give my scores in the last one, but I'm changing the rules, so I'm gonna give my score right now. The Amazing Spider-Man gets 7.5 out of 10 Zesters. Okay, now let's dive into the sequel, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Surprisingly, still directed by Mark Webb. And the reason that this comes as a shock to me is that it has a very different and almost silly and more wacky of a tone than the first movie. We have officially left the moderate elevation in fiction to an otherwise grounded universe to the outlandish and bombastic tones that comic books are more well known for. And I'm not so sure that that was a good decision. Now, besides Spider-Man 3, which some may consider to be the most hated Spider-Man film of all time, I have definitely seen people shit on this movie the most out of the whole franchise. And I gotta say, I've really never understood why. Similarly to Spider-Man 3, it can feel like it has a little too much on its plate at times, especially with how rushed its final act can feel, but I think it executes on everything just about as well as it could. It has some silly writing choices here and there, but what are comic books and the concept of a superhero if not silly? My monitor's turned off. And also similarly to Spider-Man 3, the pacing of this movie is a bit off the wall, so instead of analyzing it and picking it apart scene for scene, I'm going to take some broader strokes and explain the larger plot lines and focus on the smaller details that stood out to me as they come along. So let's get into it, shall we? The opening to this movie is more reminiscent of a spy thriller than any Spider-Man media I've ever seen. It recaps the opening to the first movie with Richard and Mary dropping off Peter with Aunt May and Uncle Ben, but we get to see what they did after that. It cuts to them flying on a private jet while Richard does some stuff on his computer, when an assassin disguised as a flight attendant pulls a gun on Richard while Mary is in the bathroom. A fight ensues, and eventually the plane is sent tumbling to the ground, presumably with the death of Peter's parents. The marketing surrounding these two movies made it out to seem like the secrets of Peter's parents and their past, which is a crazy fucking tongue twister, it was going to be focused on way more than it ended up being in the final product. And with how little of it was left in and how little impact it has in the grand scheme of things, I almost wish this plotline didn't exist at all. But it's something the Raimi movies didn't do, so we can call it the untold story on all the movie posters. This is like the movie marketing equivalent to YouTube clickbait. So after all that James Bond shit, we fade up to a scene of Peter diving through the sky into an opening web-swinging sequence. Now, the music in this scene, and I mean in the entire movie, is some of the best music to come out of a comic book movie, hands down. And because there's probably not going to be a better time for me to talk about this because they never do it in the movie, I'm going to talk about it now. The Spidey suit in this movie is fucking incredible. I liked the suit in the last movie because I thought it fit the tone and the vibe they were going for really well, but until the MCU Spider-Man introduced the moving lenses, this was the most visually appealing and direct adaptation of the costume from the comics to the big screen. Everything about this suit is perfect. The colors are vibrant. The material has this kind of reflective sheen that gives it a lot of depth and detail. The webbing is actually black, but it's got this almost rubbery shine to it that looks really good on camera. And the lenses are the perfect shape. The one complaint that I have about it, and of course I do because I've always got to have at least one, is that I feel like the chest logo is maybe just a little bit too far down. If they brought it up by like an inch or an inch and a half, it would actually be the perfect Spider-Man suit. Regardless, this is my favorite on-screen Spidey suit, and it has been that way since I saw this movie in theaters fucking 10 years ago. Shit, that was 10 years ago. I don't like how time works, dude. There was clearly a lot of work put into the CGI to match the practical suit to the digi-double, even down to the wrinkles and folds in the fabric of the costume. They even went as far to have underwear lines showing through the suit, and that's such an incredibly small detail, but it elevates the effects just that little bit, furthering that visual trick that there's actually a person inside the suit when there obviously couldn't be. Anyways, this movie has some of the most amazing swinging and general visuals in honestly any superhero movie. I've seen this opening swing scene an unbelievable amount of times. Anytime it's randomly on my Instagram Explore page or my TikTok For You page, I always watch it in its entirety. And I mean no hyperbole, I'm willing to die on this hill. But this movie, visually, is leaps and bounds above anything else in the Spider-Man franchise, besides the Spider-Verse movies, but that's why we're not talking about those ones. I mean, just look at it. I don't even have to describe what's good about this. It's just perfect. Until Peter dicks around and gets like 3 or 4 people killed in a pileup because he's too busy cracking jokes. Yeah, the general lack of care from Peter in this situation strikes me as a tad out of character for him. Sometimes in other media, Peter is willing to let himself take a hit or two if it means getting in the punchline of his joke.
How? How are you always wherever I'm doing a job? What do you got, some kind of spider sense or something?
That's funny you should say that.
But he never really does that when other people's lives are at stake. But this is really the only time that I felt like in the movie where Peter was acting particularly out of character. Other than that, they give him a lot of cute little moments, like where he walks this kid home from school, or when it cuts to him with the fireman's helmet on when he's spraying down Electro. These little heartwarming and comedic bits highlight just what kind of hero Spider-Man is. He's not the no-nonsense Captain America type, but he's also not the careless, edgy, verging on Deadpool type either. He's solidly in between those two characters, and I think that they strike that balance pretty well here. Anyways, during this high-speed car chase following an Oscorp truck full of plutonium, we're introduced to the Russian mobster named Alexei Sistevich, which you comic nerds might realize as the name of the Rhino. People like to say that he's the third villain of this movie, but given the fact that he's only in the very beginning and the very end with probably less than 3 minutes of screen time, I think that's just a little bit of a stretch. Also, while we're talking about him, I fucking hate this big mechanical robot rhino suit. Like, I totally understand why they took this approach, but when you think about it from an in-universe perspective, why in the world did Oscorp manufacture this suit? at all. Like, I can understand the Doc Ock arms because those have a real world practical application. I can understand the vulture wings because, I mean, what human doesn't want the ability to fly? But a big, mechanical, rhino-inspired suit that can shoot missiles serves what purpose exactly? Except for committing acts of terrorism. In this opening scene, we are also briefly introduced to Max Dillon, also known as Electro, played by Jamie Foxx. And this is such a strange casting choice. If you ask me, they could have had a little more depth and nuance to the character, but he's just a very weird guy with a big old boy crush on Spider-Man. This short interaction where Peter shows him the smallest bit of human decency makes him go off the rails in complete obsession. Spider-Man becomes his, like, imaginary best friend. He fantasizes about harming people that even mention Spider-Man in a slightly negative connotation. Yeah, I don't know, it's really hard to take this character seriously, but I'll touch more on that later. The other important thing that this scene establishes is that Peter is seeing visions of Captain Stacy all the time. The promise that he has purposefully broken is haunting him, and I think the way that that's handled following what was laid in place by the first movie is done in a very satisfying way. Due to the car chase, Peter misses Gwen's valedictorian speech and almost his own walk across the stage, but he makes it in just enough time to get recognized by Stan Lee. Man, I really miss Stan Lee cameos. Those were the days. Also, even though I personally like this speech that Gwen gives, it's very obviously meant to be said to Peter later in the movie to give him motivation or whatever. They did the same thing in the first movie with this voicemail that Uncle Ben leaves him because Peter listens to it after everything goes down, and when you listen to it, it's like they're giving these speeches with the forethought that they're going to die and that this is going to mean more to Peter at a later date. Like, they're just so melodramatic, especially the voicemail. I don't know why I didn't talk about that earlier, but you just listen to it and you think, who actually talks like this? Within the first 20 minutes, Peter and Gwen break up again because he feels really shitty about breaking his promise to her father, and because the last movie ended on a good note and we need conflict and emotional stakes for you to care about what's happening. My nitpicks aside though, this scene is very well acted on Andrew and Emma's part. It feels like you're actually watching two people work through a believable relationship conflict. Now, totally out of the blue, we're introduced to Harry Osborn, along with the first on-screen appearance of Norman Osborn, who was mentioned by name in the first movie, but was never shown on screen. We learned there that the regrowth theorem Dr. Connors was working on was intended to cure this fatal disease that runs in the Osborn family that both him and Harry are dying from. He calls it retroviral hyperplasia, which is a totally fake-ass disease in the real world, but I think it's way funnier that he genuinely refers to it as the Osborn curse. You're telling me that this shit left the writer's room? So Harry's whole subplot this movie is that his dad dies of the Osborn curse, but not before telling Harry that he will soon die of the same thing. Peter hears the news and he tries to reconnect with Harry, but he's a bit hesitant at first. So we get a couple scenes of them hanging out and them catching up, and I kind of like their scenes together. They really have that energy of friends that haven't spoken to each other in a decade. We get some more scenes establishing that Harry has now inherited everything related to Oscorp at the displeasure of the other higher-ups. Also, this movie introduces Felicia Hardy, who is Black Cat in every other piece of Spider-Man media, and she's Harry's assistant in this. She doesn't really do anything all that important in this movie, but I'm sure that there was plans for her to do stuff in the scrapped third movie. So after accidentally stumbling across some old files with research from Richard Parker about the healing properties of spiders, Harry gets the idea that not only did one of the super spiders Richard developed give Spider-Man his powers, but that he also needs Spider-Man's blood to cure him of this rare Osborn curse disease. Yeah, there's a lot of insane jumps to conclusions in this situation, even though he's actually right. In the grand scheme of things, Richard Parker did make the serum, and that's the spider that gave Peter his powers, but he doesn't know that. He should never know that. And despite having no clue as to if the blood of Spider-Man would help him or not, he tries to convince Peter to get Spider-Man on board, thinking that they know each other because Peter took his picture this one time. And I think his response to this is really funny.
You took his picture.
So?
You know him.
Harry, I took a picture from a long way away. I used a long lens. I don't know him.
So Peter, dressed as Spider-Man, refuses to give Harry his blood due to the unforeseen consequences surrounding that, and of course, he's pretty upset about this.
You're a fraud, Spider-Man!
Ultimately, Harry's search for anything related to this spider cure leads to him being framed by this douche at Oscorp for the imprisonment and experimentation being done on Electro, and essentially him getting fired from his own company. So yeah, Harry really gets dicked on in this movie. So intertwined with that plot, we have the Peter and Gwen doing this will they, won't they dance, because she's super close to making it into Oxford University, which means she would be moving to England. And this is obviously very upsetting for Peter, and something he tries to cope with in many different ways throughout this movie, one of which is doing a lot more crime fighting. Like I was talking about earlier, there's a few montages of him swinging around, stopping robberies, all that jazz, as well as researching and testing out new ideas for his web shooters so they're protected from Electro's powers. Something that is established in this movie is that Peter can be extremely selfish at times, and that this selfishness isn't always consistent. He spends a lot of time in this movie trying to convince Gwen to not go to England, even though he states in this breakup scene at the beginning that putting her in danger makes him unable to live with himself. Wouldn't the best way for her to not be in danger be for her to move to another country? I don't fucking know, man. I just work here. Eventually, Gwen actually does make it into Oxford, and Peter, desperately holding on to one of the few things that still grounds him to the normal aspects of his life, does almost everything in his power to convince her to stay. But he makes the last-minute decision to go with her to England just as she's about to leave. So basically, Peter spends this whole movie trying to have his cake and eat it too, as they say. But he soon learns his lesson, as this whole plotline culminates into a pretty faithful adaptation of that issue in the comics titled The Death of Gwen Stacy. And you'll never guess what happens in that. The third plotline going on is Peter looking into his father's death a little more to find out what actually happened. He has this little research montage where he does the classic string connecting pictures on the wall trope thing, but once that gets him seemingly nowhere, he talks to Aunt May about it, and she basically tells Peter that, from her understanding, Richard left because his research with the spiders was worth a lot of money that he didn't want to give to Norman Osborn. This news upsets Peter, causing him to tear down all of his research and throw his dad's calculator at the wall. But wait, there's these secret train tokens in the calculator that basically leads him to find out his dad's secret underground train laboratory, where we get the confirmation of what's already been implied since the last movie. Richard Parker had direct involvement in creating the radioactive spiders. I know, that must have come as a huge shock to you. That longer scene that I talked about in the last movie where this information was revealed by Dr. Ratha must have been cut for the sole intention of them elaborating on it more in this movie, but honestly, it's not all that shocking of a reveal to have this much time dedicated to it. Also, it's revealed that Richard spliced his own DNA into the spiders, so the reason Peter didn't get mutated or turned evil from the spider bite was because I guess it only gives all the cool stuff to people in the same bloodline. Now, having the spiders be genetically altered to only work on the Parker bloodline is kind of silly to me, and defeats that whole idea that anybody can wear the mask that is such a key aspect of the character. I wonder if they were ever going to try and introduce Miles Morales or other spider heroes into this universe, and how they would have gone about explaining them getting their powers if the Richard Parker spiders just wouldn't have worked. So, on top of all of that, if you're keeping track, this is plotline number 4. You have the origin story of Electro, who's supposed to be our main villain, I guess. Max Dillon is a quiet, reserved, and clearly mentally unstable nerd until he accidentally falls into a vat of electric eels or something, and he transforms into the rejected 4th member of the Blue Man group. Him and Spider-Man fight in Times Square closer to the beginning of the movie, and I really like this action scene and the visuals, but conceptually, it kind of falls flat. Electro essentially turns on Spider-Man because he saves this one guy from being crushed, and it changes all of the screens in Times Square from focusing on Max to Spider-Man's heroic deed, and he gets all jealous about it. So basically his whole motivation as a villain is that he's tired of being ignored. He wants to be seen and recognized like Spider-Man is. but when he realizes that he can't have that, he goes off the rails and starts shooting electricity at people. Eventually, he's defeated by Peter and captured by Oscorp. But after Harry is fired from Oscorp, he goes and breaks Electro out of confinement so he can kind of be his bodyguard for a little bit, and so he can be the big bad for a couple of minutes. Now, something that I noticed upon this rewatch is that Electro is given some of the most cringe-inducing dialogue I think that's ever been given to an on-screen supervillain. It feels like a good 70% of his lines were just intended to sound cool and be vaguely threatening so they could have stuff to fill up the trailers with.
I can feel it in the walls. I can feel it in my veins. No matter what you do, Doc, you can't contain it. It's the force of nature. Like me.
You know that scene at the end of Venom where Cletus Cassidy says,
"When I get out of here, and I will, there's gonna be carnage."
That's what most of his lines feel like to me. And I know I have the tendency to refer to the villains in these movies as cartoonishly evil, but Electro is definitely the worst offender of this trope. And some of you may be confused when I say stuff like that, because most supervillain type characters are cartoonishly evil at their core. It's very clear when a character is written to be evil for the sake of being evil. And this works when you're talking about a comic book or an animated adaptation, because the audience already has a far wider stretch of disbelief for those kinds of mediums. But when you pluck those kind of character tropes out of stuff like this and you try to put it into a live-action blockbuster film with Academy Award-winning actors, I'm expecting a little more depth, a little more relatability. But Max Dillon is just an incel turned Duracell. Because it's a battery. And the electricity, let's just move on. So yeah, we have those 4 overarching storylines that kind of interact with each other throughout the film, and they all clash together for the final act, and I don't know, this shit just ends up feeling super rushed. They were really trying to put 10 pounds of sausage in a 5-pound bag, if you know what I'm saying. This movie is only about 5 minutes longer than the first one, but it's trying to cram all of these antagonists, all of these storylines, all of this shit that gets shoved into what shouldn't be a short runtime, but it ends up feeling that way as a result. Anyways, with Harry and Electro teamed up, they break into Oscorp, and Harry finds the extracted venom from the super spider, or something, that he is super sure will cure him of this disease, but it actually transforms him into the Green Goblin. Oh no. Can I just say that Dane DeHaan's performance as Harry is really strange? It's like he's constantly blasted out of his mind. His line delivery ranges from passable to laughably bad, and I'll let you guess which side it leans on more often than not.
Oh, God, I'm sorry. That's just not the answer we were looking for.
So everything kind of comes to a head as the final act begins. Peter's research into his father reveals this whole side of the story that he had no idea about initially, and he finally gives him some closure on why he was abandoned as a young boy. Peter decides that he wants to follow Gwen to England because fuck Aunt May, I guess. Harry is in a worse condition than ever, with him dying of the Osborn curse and being fired from his own company, but after breaking Electro out, he gets what he's been looking for the entire movie, the super spider venom that's been in some secret room at Oscorp the whole time. All of this stuff happens so quickly that there's really no time to breathe or to ponder on anything before the power in the entire city is shut down and we begin entering the final confrontation. Peter and Gwen come to the conclusion that Max is the one to blame for all of this and gives Peter the idea of magnetizing his web shooters so they can hold an electrical charge instead of frying immediately upon contact with Electro. As Peter leaves to go confront Max, Gwen insists on going with him, but since this is obviously a very dangerous situation, Peter whips her hand to a car instead and makes his way to the big power grid. I feel the need to stress this again. From a visual and sound standpoint, the final battle is fucking outstanding. This is easily the best on-screen action scene in the whole franchise, but it's hard to be emotionally invested in what's going on. See, they kind of tried to make Max Dillon a tragic villain, quote unquote, but his actions and characterization just don't fit that narrative in the slightest. After the scene in Times Square, he's just a mustache twirling villain that wants to take all of the power from the city and kill Spider-Man. So if I turn off my brain for a second, I'm having a hell of a time. But when you try and dissect Electro's motivations and understand where he's coming from emotionally, it kind of falls apart. So whatever, there's flips and explosions and slow motion dodging until Electro gets the upper hand and things are looking dire for Peter, which is when Gwen pops out with the cop car and hits Electro. Something about this feels a little familiar to me. Anyways, I've seen a lot of people talking about this scene online recently, praising Andrew Garfield's physical performance, and I gotta agree. I don't even have to play the dialogue for this scene for you to understand that Peter is very upset at Gwen for showing up here. Together, they come up with the idea to fill Electro with so much energy so he explodes or something. I haven't mentioned it yet, but with all of this going on, they also cut back and forth between Aunt May trying to help people at the hospital with no power, and these two planes that are about to crash into each other. It kind of just feels like they needed more ways to show that this is a widespread issue to raise the stakes. And I guess that these scenes achieve that, but I think it's a little bit unnecessary. So yada yada, Peter and Gwen defeat Electro and he explodes in just enough time for nothing major to go wrong. And there's a couple of scenes where the plot gives you some breathing room until the Green Goblin enters the scene. I've always found the way Peter delivers this line to be hilarious.
Harry, what did you do?
He's like, damn bro, you are chopped to shit right now. Anyways, I guess Spider-Man and Gwen being in the same place tips Harry off to Peter's secret identity. So just to be a dick, Harry grabs Gwen and a short fight scene ensues as they climb to the top of a clock tower. Now I want to take a moment and discuss something that I haven't even mentioned yet, and that's this movie's general theme being placed around time, specifically not having enough of it. And this is pretty hard to miss. The very first shot of the movie is a zoom out on Richard Parker's watch with the ticks of a clock in the background. The very first line of spoken dialogue is Richard saying that he thought he'd have more time with his son.
I always thought that I'd have more time.
The opening swing sequence is based around the fact that Peter's not going to make it to his graduation on time. Gwen's whole graduation speech begins with a statement about how time is luck and it's important not to waste it. And this final battle is where this motif peaks in the film. Gwen is holding on for dear life as Peter is physically trying to stop the gears of the clock tower, trying to give himself more time. But ultimately, he fails. Peter finally runs out of time after spending the whole film just barely defying it. And Gwen, the one person he's been trying to protect all along, falls victim to his own miscalculation, his own selfishness. Despite Gwen insisting that it was her choice to be there, ultimately she would have been on her plane to England by now. But instead, she lies lifeless in Peter's arms because he couldn't let her go until it was too late. Honestly, it's tragic. This scene is so emotional that it almost feels out of place in a film that otherwise hasn't taken itself all that seriously. I love this movie for committing to this, to punishing Peter for his unchecked possessiveness. The audience is shown that sometimes you don't get your cake at all, and it's something that everybody has to live with at some point. Even Spider-Man. We see Gwen's funeral, and there's a montage of Peter visiting her grave through spring, summer, fall, and winter. And I've always loved this scene. I think it's a great and silent way to express how distraught he is to the audience. But after those beautiful scenes, we're right back to silly, goofy comic book land with Harry Osborn being visited in Ravencroft by this shadowed figure in a black fedora. They speak briefly about Spider-Man being gone and creating the Sinister Six. The security robot at Oscorp calls him Mr. Fears, and I had to look this up, but apparently this is an extremely niche Spider-Man villain from the comics known as the Gentleman. Essentially, all he's really known for is bringing the Sinister Six together, so they were hardcore teasing for another sequel. And like I mentioned earlier, in this shot of the Gentleman walking, you can see the Vulture's wings and Doc Ock's arms, but he stops at the Rhino suit to give to Alexei from the beginning of the movie. So, we learn via the same news report that talks about Alexei breaking out of prison that Peter has stopped being Spider-Man for 5 months after the death of Gwen. And just like in the original trilogy, we get this scene that heavily implies that Aunt May knows Peter is Spider-Man. After she gives some words of encouragement, he decides to dust off the old web shooters and jump back into action to stop the Rhino. This whole sequence is kind of a poor man's version of that Spider-Man 2 plotline. The difference between that and this movie is that Peter only really stops being Spider-Man Spider-Man because of his own self-pity here, as opposed to actually losing his powers and whatnot. The movie ends with this cut to black as It's On Again by Alicia Keys featuring Kendrick Lamar plays, and I think this is one of my favorite songs to come out of a movie soundtrack. I unironically have this song in my gym playlist because the amount of motivation it gives me is unrivaled. Alright, so clearly I had a lot less to say about this movie than the first one, but the villains are way less interesting and fleshed out, and there's really only minor differences between the other characters, like Peter and Gwen and Aunt May. For the most part, they are stagnant characters, staying the same as they were in the last movie. And the introduced characters, namely Harry and Electro, don't get fleshed out nearly enough to leave a long-lasting emotional impact. Anytime Harry was on screen as Green Goblin, I couldn't stop thinking about how emotionally charged that fight was in Spider-Man 3. But the fight with Peter and Harry at the end of this movie has such little build-up and downright comedic acting and design decisions, and it was really hard to be emotionally invested in Harry throughout the entire film, but especially once he's Green Goblin. So ultimately, I really enjoy the themes and messaging in this movie, but the tone is a lot more inconsistent than the first movie. The actions and visuals have improved, but the characters behind them lack substance, and that's why it's so hard to talk about The Amazing Spider-Man 2, because in my personal opinion, I think this is a bad film. Like, from a borderline film perspective, this is just not that great of a complete product, which is strange because there are random strokes of genius throughout this movie, but when you put it together, it creates this underwhelming final product. First of all, the pacing is kind of insane. I wanted to say something about how the film feeling rushed might be another example of having too little time, because as I explained earlier, time is a prevalent theme in this movie. But I don't think that was actually an artistic decision, and if it was, that's absolutely genius. But this movie really suffers from never pressing the brakes, never having a single moment to stop and actually think about what is happening. I did the most amount of pausing I think I've ever done when taking notes for one of these movie reviews during this, because I tried just letting the movie play at some points, and I realized at the point that I was typing, talking about in my review, I would be like 2 entire plot points behind from what was actually happening in the movie. Secondly, I feel like they really needed to make a choice between Electro and Harry as the main villain. Having them share the spotlight makes both of their roles feel minuscule in comparison to, say, the Lizard in the last movie. And it sucks because the foundation is there. I see what they were going for. They were definitely cooking something, but the pot might have been a little too small for the yield they were looking for, you know? You added a little too much and now the pot's starting to boil over, and this is a stupid metaphor. I'm just gonna give The Amazing Spider-Man 2 a 5 out of 10 zesters. And now, I'm going to end the video. Alright. I know it took me a very long time to make the part 2 to this series, but it can take me a while and a lot of work to make these videos. I'm not always in the mood to sit down and rewatch these movies that I've seen fucking 20 times before, but I haven't seen the MCU trilogy nearly as much. I've probably seen Homecoming like 3 or 4 times. I know I definitely saw Far From Home when it came out in theaters, and I've probably seen No Way Home like twice, but it's definitely been quite a while, so I'm looking forward to rewatching those movies for this series, but that is a discussion for the next video. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like. If you didn't, I'm sure I'll read about it down in the comments, but if you want to see more videos from me, make sure to subscribe and turn on my post notifications so you never miss a video, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace. Oh, fuck. I just talked for the last 2 hours. I think I might shoot myself.